In this video, I'll review creating color separations in Photoshop in order to prepare files for screen printing or silk screening, which is the same thing. You might use this for making art or printing posters like concert posters or making t-shirts. It's a common technique for making t-shirts. You've probably heard of silk screening t-shirts. So how would I take this image, for example, and put it on a t-shirt? Well, to do so, we'd actually have to split this into all the different composite colors that make it up, and then print each color separately. You can really only print one ink color at a time, so we'll have to split the color channels of this image into separate files, and then create halftone images for each to print onto, for example, a transparent acetate film that then might be used to create the stencil or screen needed for printing. We'll do that, and then we'll also use Photoshop to put our separate files back together again to actually simulate the look of a screen print. So let's dive into doing all of that. I'm going to take this Valkyrie composite image that I had created and prepare it for screen printing. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that the image resolution is sufficient for my needs. I've got this at 300 pixels per inch, with a size of 7 by 5. So if that's the size I wanted to put on a t-shirt, that's great. So I should mention that there's a relationship here between the image resolution and the screen frequency, which we'll cover in a minute, that will determine sort of the quality of the detail of our printed image. And so in general, we're going to need an image resolution that's about 1.5 times or maybe 2 times our screen frequency. So I'm going to just keep this at 300. That would be, maybe if I'm using a screen mesh of about 150, that would be 2 times that. So 1.5 to 2 times that, I should be good for meshes in the range of 150 to 200 for this. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But I want to check my resolution first. And so first, we'll make sure that this is sized appropriately. It is. I'll then go and change the mode here from our traditional RGB color when working on a screen to CMYK color for printing. And so we'll go ahead and convert that to CMYK, and I can see that now each of the color channels are in cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So this is a kind of color separation of each of our colors to channels, and we could certainly just look at individual channels. If this is just the black channel, that would sort of reinforce some of our color. We could see just sort of the yellow channel overlaying that black. We could see just the magenta channel, and we could see that by themselves. Each channel is actually a grayscale channel representing that particular color, and sort of how much of it is on the really is in the image, right? So I don't have quite as much cyan in this image because it is a very, if we look at the entire image, it's a very warm image. It's got a lot of oranges in it. So there's not a lot of cyan in the image, which is why that particular color channel doesn't have as much content. But the magenta channel, for example, is quite a bit darker, has a lot there. So is the yellow channel in this one. All right, so now that I've got this as a CMYK image with each of these colored channels, what we'll need to do is split these channels into separate files. So I'm going to do that by using this little menu option, and there's something called split channels. And when we choose that, you'll see what happens. It's actually going to split each of these channels into different other channels. So what we've actually created now is a series of separate channels. What I've got here in my workspace is files for each of the channels, and you'll notice that they are named underscore cyan, underscore magenta, underscore yellow, underscore black, and lastly there was a transparent channel which I actually don't need, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that particular channel. Alright, so I've got 4 channels representing the cyan, magenta, yellow, and black colors here of our image. And so now what I want to do is actually make these into halftone images. In order to actually print a sort of continuous tone image, we need to convert it to halftone, which is really a screen pattern of variable size dots that then will give you the impression of tone values in a single ink of color. And we'll overlay each of those dots on top of each other. We'll create these halftone dots on top of each other to actually recreate our color within the printing, when we go to screen print this. So let's go ahead and do that. To do that, I'm going to change the mode here to bitmap. And when we do that, we'll get a dialog box that says, okay, what's your output resolution? I'm going to keep that at 300 per inch. And what method do I want to use for this conversion? One of the methods we can use is what's called the halftone screen method. That's exactly what I want. I'm going to choose that one and click OK. We then get another dialog box with 2 or 3 actually important settings here: frequency, angle, and shape. Now, a halftone will actually create a series of rows and columns of dots, and the frequency is really how small or large those dots are. How many rows and columns of them do we actually have? The smaller the number we put in here, the bigger the dots will be. So just as an example, let's say I put a small number and I click OK, you'll see that we get these large dots that are here, and we don't have as much quality or detail within the image itself. So you want to find the right balance here in terms of the look that you're going for. That is really too rough for me, and I'm going to undo that, and let's reassign that again under image mode bitmap. And as I choose halftone screen, I can set a larger frequency, and that would make these dots sort of smaller, if you will. We can zoom in and take a look at the different dots that comprise that particular color channel. So I'm going to undo that again and talk just a little bit more about the settings here. So frequency, sometimes it's hard to know what to set that at. In general, it might depend on the mesh that you're using for your screen print. The mesh is what you're actually pushing the ink through, and there's different sort of weights to that mesh. And generally, if you're screen printing, you might use 110 or 156 or 196 as a mesh. So 196 is pretty good for multicolor prints on relatively light garments, for example. And so if I was, a good rule of thumb is to use around whatever that mesh is, you could divide that by 4 in terms of your frequency here. So if that's 196, I could divide that by 4 and have a frequency of maybe up to about 50 for those dots. And if I click OK, I'll get a lot of small dots in this case, and I'd be able to print that to a mesh and have a little bit finer detail inside of my image. I'm going to go ahead and undo that one more time and not actually worry about having such fine detail. And instead, I'm going to make a halftone image here with a frequency of maybe like 24, for example. The next thing that's going to be important is the angle. Now, the angle will determine how each of these dots are laid down. And what you really don't want to do is create a bunch of patterns inside your design. And so the angle will help avoid that. But what we'll need to do is use sort of different angles for each channel. I think it's best to understand that through looking at an image of how the dots might lay down. And basically, in order to avoid having a kind of more disturbing kind of interference pattern in your halftone dots, generally you need to print each color at an angle that's about 30 degrees apart from the other color. The problem is that with 4 colors, you sort of repeat your pattern every 90 degrees. And so if you're spinning a circle 90 degrees, it sort of repeats right at that 90-degree point. So usually people use yellow as the one that's not 30 degrees apart, because that disturbance is a little harder to spot in the yellow. So to create a more traditional sort of moire pattern, a rosette pattern, you'll typically lay your cyan down at 15 degrees, your magenta down at 75, your yellow down at 0, and the black down at 45 degrees. And then they'll mix together to give you a sort of more traditional pattern. So depending on how you lay these down, you'll get different types of patterns depending on how you choose your angles. But if you choose the same angle for every single one, they'll basically lay on top of each other, maybe sort of cancel out each other a little bit more, and you want them to be a little bit offset, but not necessarily creating disturbing patterns. So we're going to use this more traditional 75, 45, 15, 0 formula. And so I'm going to come back to Photoshop here. I'm working with the cyan pattern first, and so the angle that I wanted for that particular pattern was 15 degrees. So I'm going to go ahead and use a frequency of 24, which I'll use for all of them, and then have an angle of 15 degrees for the cyan. Now, the shape that I want my dots to be, you can actually change that. Diamonds, ellipses, some people might use ellipses, for example. I'm going to keep them round, which would be the most traditional for halftone dots. So I'm going to go ahead and use the round shape and create my bitmap image. Now, a bitmap image is 0 or 1. It's black or white, in other words. So we're limiting this down to just black or white, and that's what we'd want. We'd print this to an acetate film, and the areas in black would not expose our emulsion, and the areas in white would be transparent and would expose the emulsion, and so therefore we could sort of print this pattern on and use this to sort of create our stencils that we push our ink through. So there's our first one, using cyan. So we have to do the same thing for the other channels. We'll go there, use the mode of bitmap. We're going to choose a method of halftone screen, and then of course I'm going to use the same frequency for each of these, but change the angle. So the angle of this one I'm going to make 75 in this particular case for the magenta, and I'll produce that particular one. That's great. I'll go to yellow, say image, mode, bitmap, halftone screen. The angle for the yellow is simply going to be 0. And then lastly, for the black, we'll do the same thing, image, mode, bitmap, and I could then create a halftone screen pattern, and the angle that I want for the black is 45 degrees. Okay, so I now have 4 separate files, each with our halftone dots in them. And so some of the ones that had more color in them, like the magenta channel, they have a lot more sort of black to create those tones, right? So we'll see that there's a lot more of that particular color than in the cyan channel, for example. And there's quite a bit in the yellow channel as well. All right, so that's great. And if I was printing these, I could then print them to a acetate transparent film in order to use my stencils, in order to create stencils for printing. So I might do that, but I could also save these out, for example, as PDF files and have them ready for printing. What I want to do next, though, is simulate what would it be like to take all of these separate channels and actually print them with cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And what would the final result look like when we're printing it onto a shirt or for a concert poster or something? So what I'm going to do is create a new file for that. I'll go to my last file here and just say File New. And what I'll do is make a file of the same size. Now this was 2100 by 1500. It was in inches. It was 7 by 5. So I'll make that the exact same size. And I'll make sure that this particular new file is in CMYK color. I'll convert to CMYK. There's nothing in any of the channels. But now that I have this untitled one file, I can go back to my actual channels and copy out that content. So whatever's in the layer for my cyan channel here, what I could do is simply select everything in that layer and copy it. So I'm going to Command A to select all, Command C to copy it, and then I'm going to go into my new file, the untitled one. I'm going to choose the cyan channel and simply paste that content into the cyan channel. So there it is. It would show just the cyan if we were to turn everything on. If I was just looking at the cyan channel by itself, right, we just see the black and white content that's a part of that. Then I'll do that for these other ones as well. So I'll switch over to the magenta. I'm going to select all, copy that, go back to my new document that I had, look at the channels, and paste in the magenta channel. Then I'll go to the yellow channel and the black and white bitmap image halftone that I have there. I'm going to go ahead and select all, Command A, Command C to copy, or of course Control on a PC, Control C, and then I'll paste that into the yellow channel, Control V to paste that in. Then I'll do the same for the black channel, copy it, and then paste it into the black channel. All right, when we bring this all together, each of the channels, you'll see that we've created our image again using this kind of halftone pattern system that we could use for printing. It might feel a little rough. If I zoom out of this though, you can kind of get a sense of that image and how it would look printed perhaps on a t-shirt or whatnot with each of the halftones there. You also, if we start to zoom in on this, can start to see some of the ways that the ink is laying down and the different patterns that are emerging from this. We can literally see the cyan, the magenta, and the yellow as they're emerging to sort of create our image that's here. So we can see how all of that will kind of come together in order to make our final product. So that's one way we could sort of recreate this image, simply pasting into the varying color channels of a CMYK image. I'll show you another way that we could do this, however, is to actually take these colors and let's say instead of pasting them in channels, we pasted them into layers. So I'll go ahead and paste the black layer. I'll go ahead and just call that K. I'll make another channel and go to the yellow layer and copy all of that content and paste that into a layer here as well. I'm going to call that Y for being the yellow channel. Then I'm going to make a new layer for the magenta channel. I'll make sure that I choose magenta, copy all of that content, and then paste it into a new layer here that I'll label as M for magenta. And then lastly, I'll create the cyan layer here by copying that content out and going into my other document and pasting the layer for the cyan channel. So each of these would come together in order to make the final image. Now, there's no color on any of these. So if we take any of these channels, like we could overlay them or multiply them together, but we could see the sort of moire pattern that's emerging here with those channels coming together, and that's what happens. That kind of rosette pattern will sort of emerge from this when you're making these kinds of dots, and sometimes those patterns, that's why we want the angle, because those patterns can get annoying depending on how you make them. And so usually those rosette patterns are some of the most effective ways to not make the pattern feel too dominant inside the image. So anyway, I could put all of these as multiply in order to see that, but there's no color in any of these images yet. So I'm going to return this back to normal, and let's apply some color. So one way that I could do that is to do like an overlay on top of it. So I'm going to go ahead and do like a solid color. I wanted the cyan color, so I'll say 100% under the cyan channel and 0 in the other magenta, yellow, and black channels. And that would give me a pure cyan color fill that's there. I'll then apply that color fill directly to the image that's underneath. And what I'm going to do is change the blend mode to the lighter color here. So let's turn off these other channels so we don't see those. You'll see that this particular solid color fill would only fill in the sort of black pixels there of our image. So there we go for that particular one. Now I'm going to go to the magenta one. Let's do the exact same thing. I'll turn on magenta. I'm going to create an adjustment layer for a solid color that will then be pure magenta. So let's try that out. 0, 0, 0 for these other ones. Pure magenta. And then I'm going to use a clipping mask, holding down the Alt key in between our two layers. I'll apply that just to the layer below, and then say that I want it to apply only as a whatever the lighter color is. That's the thing I want to have show up, and we'll have that show up. We'll see that it's just the magenta dots now and black on that particular layer. So then I'll do the same thing for yellow. Apply a solid color adjustment layer with 100% yellow, nothing else in this particular case but the yellow, I want to use the lighter color once again as my overlay, turn on the yellow that was there, and we'll just apply that to the layer immediately underneath. I can start to then turn on these other layers, and we can start to see sort of what's happening with the varying layers themselves as they interact. I'll turn on the black layer that's back there, and then each of these have a multiply applied. So if it was on normal, we might not see this quite the same. So each of these have to have, right, if we're on normal, it would take over. The white would be opaque in this case. So we need to have something like multiply in order to have these show. And so each of these will be set to multiply, and we'll end up getting a simulation of sort of what that would look like if we printed each of these on top of each other. There's a bit of an additive effect on some of the colors as they overlap in terms of how they'll sort of create our image here. So that's another way that we could take a look at this. So a couple different ways to explore recreating our image from the black and white bitmap halftone images that we had ripped out, color separated out of our CMYK image. And we could then, take each of these black and white images and use those in order to create the stencils we needed for silk screening or screen printing. Anyway, so that's a way that we can use Photoshop to simulate some of this stuff or create that. Hopefully you found that instructional, and happy screen printing.